Thanks again, Amy. And Rob, thanks so much for those great broad comments and observations and trends. And I think now what we'll really try to do is have a conversation that's more tailored really toward our community. So while you're writing your questions down, because I think there's a lot to dig into there, why don't we just take maybe just a minute from each of our panelists. Kelly Pollock, Executive Director at COCO, why don't you start and give us your comments on Rob's comments.
Well, where to start? There's a lot to think about. I think for me, one of the highlights or thing that really stands out is this blurring of the sectors, and one of the things I think in a practical way how I've already seen it impact our sector, and as a practitioner in our organization, it's workforce implications. I mean, you talked about the big shift in leadership that has been in transition and continues to come our way, and I think this has very real implications. And for all of those who work in nonprofits, we know that we are our people, and it's really about the quality and the brain energy that you can get within the organization. And I think it has huge implications for our workforce, and the mission has always been how we attract great people and hold them, and that blur and the way that compensation and all that will impact that. I think that is one major thing to really for us to struggle with over the next several years.
Nice. Let's just go right down the line. So Carolyn Kindle, Secretary at the Crawford Taylor Foundation. What did you think the high points really were and struck home with you?
Sure, absolutely. I agree with Kelly that I think this blurring of the sort of corporate social responsibility and nonprofit is an interesting dynamic happening. And if I look at the enterprise holdings perspective, we have a sustainability department, and in essence their job is to find ways to reduce our impact on the environment. But as a board member on nonprofits as well, you are right. You look at marketing plans and strategic plans and funding and endowment plans, and it seems as a couple of years ago, that stuff wasn't as talked about as much. And I think especially on the nonprofit side, as you go out and fundraise and build these, whether they're programs or whatever, now this whole question of how do we keep it around? How are we going to sustain that? So I think it's interesting to kind of watch the flip. And I hadn't really thought about the human piece until you just said that. And I think that's another thing that's going to be interesting is you're competing now for people that have to, in some cases, have the same set of skills, whether it's for-profit or not-for-profit.
Right. And Starsky, what do you think from the Deaconess Foundation perspective?
It's all local. It's all here, whether we know it or not. As I listened to Rob talk about the California parks, I remembered the conversation earlier this year about the St. Louis County parks and recreation. As he talked about the L3Cs, I thought about meetings with the Mission Center here in St. Louis, which is this hybrid organization. And as we talk with them and continue to explore their support model for different nonprofits in our community, we actually, from a capacity building perspective, see things like that as, and we've actually used this language in-house, as capacity building 2.0. So it's the next level of the infrastructure building that we that we have talked about over the course of the last decade. And then finally, I hope we hear the call. As we talk about the politicization of the nonprofit sector with 501c3s, 529s, and the like, that we also, as nonprofits who are service providers, have to hear ringing in our ears the words of the text Forces for Good, that effective organizations, high-impact organizations, not only serve but advocate. And those of us who live in the philanthropic sector as foundation leaders and the like must stand up to this call and this looking to foundations for policy leadership and understand that means we must operate in a different way, that our programs and our gifts are solid and they should inform this perspective and engagement in policy and can't simply be the core business. And perhaps with less dollars to give, this is an opportunity for us to consider another way that we can have the same degree of impact with less dollars, because the corpus is not what it used to be. So I hope we hear the call.
Very nice. And Jorge from Casa de Salud, what you think?
For me, all aspects of Rob's talk led to the conclusion, which is the redefinition of the social compact. In my sector, I think a great example is now with the finally getting the ruling from the Supreme Court on the Affordable Care Act. Missouri is most likely going to be one of the states that does not expand Medicaid, and that's going to mean hundreds of thousands who are not going to be covered potentially. And I think government's going to look to organizations like CASA then to pick up that slack. And so where we were first called really to be the safety net, so when people fell, we would catch them, now we're actually being called to be the tightrope itself. And that is, I think, a massive change and a true redefining of what the social compact is, and that I think will have massive implications for nonprofits across sectors.
Nice. So as we think about, what we know is a wave of government funding cuts that are going to come on top of the existing funding cuts, and that staggering 2029 recovery before we get to 2007 levels in terms of Missouri state funding. And then we kind of mix that up with this emphasis on impact investing and more emphasis on outcomes. So maybe, Rob, why don't you start us off with, do you think that this new emphasis on impact investing and outcomes is going to have an impact on how the government allocates reduced resources that it has, and how you think that might play out?
I'd say there are inklings that it could have an effect at the federal level, and I think it's more likely to have some larger effects at the state level. So you all probably have heard of the creation in the White House of the Office of Social Innovation. And that entity was not a massively funded enterprise within the federal government relative to other agencies. But nevertheless, it's a beachhead that is formed where even at the federal level, we're now getting people thinking about the ways in which innovative enterprises, be they for-profit or nonprofit, can be championed by the state in order to forward some type of public or social mission. Another small example of this, I don't know if I have all the details to hand, but there was an interesting report in the news within the past month that Michael Bloomberg, mayor of New York City, not through his office as the mayor, but rather through his office as the head of the Bloomberg Foundation, was going to issue some type of public agency challenge grant, where the idea was innovation within municipal government that, again, could come from any part of the sector. The point was innovation with a genuine impact. So as I'd say there's a beachhead that's been formed. It's not a massive trend yet, but has the potential to become one.
Jorge, have you seen, in terms of going after government funding, service fee, service contracts, things like that, where you've had any type of an increased emphasis or sense of competition, where the good evaluation and outcome measurement that you do has been able to position you better?
So not for government, because we have actually had no government funding whatsoever. We've really gone with the generosity of foundations, particularly regional foundations, and tremendous individual giving. I think that, however, as government funding is being depleted, we are seeing other organizations who would have been getting funding from that revenue source now start to go into more of the avenues that we are seeking funding for. And so I think that might have a potential impact for us. We are trying to make sure that we are not operating out of a scarcity mentality. That's why when we mentioned about collaboration, why that particularly has been so important for us, so that we are worrying less about where our if we're going to lose money from this sector of funding or increase it in that one, but rather create as many collaborations as possible so that we give a wide variety of funders an opportunity to see a collaborative effort that has greater impact, so that in that respect, even though maybe it's a smaller pie, we can still have a demonstrable impact that will keep funding coming in.
You bring up an interesting point about the previously then government-funded organizations, particularly, as Rob said, in the social services, now diving into the philanthropic pie. I think that pretty much every funder in this region has seen a slew of social service organizations coming out with their own special events and galas and things, and trying to really get into that mix. And then that need, we know that the funding isn't enough to replace government funding, so we do have to learn how to do more with less, and we also have to figure out other revenue streams to tap into. Kelly, can you talk a little bit? You've started some very entrepreneurial business-related ventures at COCA. What has the success of those been like for you, really, in terms of true revenue that you're able to bring in, but also in terms of the conversations now that you can have with donors?
Well, the revenue continues to be a struggle. However, the idea and the conversations have been game changers. And so the one thing I think all nonprofits are trying to deal with is, how do you take risk? How do you fail? How do you innovate when you have so little wiggle room, that there are not large safety nets to fall back on? And it's one thing over the past few years that we've really been trying to work on and have really honest, open dialogue with our funders, with our board, that it's imperative that we try new models, that we start to explore new territory, and you have to give us the capacity to fail and try these, because it's the only way that we will change the model. So I think that right now in some of our programs, we've done it both programmatically in our work in the schools through a program called Interchange, where we're working in a collaborative model, and then working with the business community in an arts-based training program out to the business community. I think it has huge implications in terms of advocacy and making the case known, and really talking about how we can collaborate and build a new model in a way to be a game changer here in terms of the impact that we're providing. And we have seen great gains in terms of revenue, but to get these startups off the ground and to try new projects and programs, it's this idea from the funding base trying to help us in terms of providing money to fund our services, but how do we get the capacity to grow and change while doing that? That's really the struggle that we deal with, and I'm sure most other nonprofits struggle with as well.
So as nonprofits are trying to innovate and restructure and test things out and test models out, let's get a funder's perspective from Starsky and Caroline as far as how those kinds of experiments are hitting your perspective and your board's perspective in terms of investments at a time when there are such immediate needs that the recession has created that are just there and glaring.
I'll say, as it relates to impact investing, again, everything's local. Our best return last year, from a foundation perspective, was an investment in Justine Peterson, where we, from a socially responsible investment standpoint, set aside funding to provide them with funding in order to then make microloans to individuals in the community to make sure that they could make basic home repairs and didn't have to go and take out payday loans and those kinds of things, providing people with financial literacy assistance. So as we talk about impact investing, we recognize that while we had a long-term relationship and received 3% there, we received 1.5% on the corpus in the market. So we began to think, well, maybe this is something we should explore more. And again, double bottom line, there's an opportunity to be helpful and to be successful to a 501c3, this community development financial institution in our community. So that begins to make sense from a funder's perspective to explore these kinds of options and opportunities while also doing good as aligned with mission, and there are opportunities to do that locally. So I think, how does that affect other nonprofits and social services? As there are opportunities and we begin to think about what the ask is, sometimes there's an opportunity to ask from a socially responsible investment perspective in as much as a giving or investing our services perspective. And so I think as we begin to think about, again, putting my fundraising hat back on, as nonprofits begin to think about how they reach out to funders, having that in mind is also helpful, that where there's the capacity to provide opportunity for a significant return based on a business model, a social enterprise model, then that should be a part of our mix as we think about growing revenue for nonprofits as well.
I think to start out, I would say, while I think all this is important, innovation in programs, I think it's important to kind of take a step back and think, would I go into business with this partner if it were you starting a business, a bakery, for instance, with one of your friends? So I think one of the things you need to consider is, who are your long-term donors, and who are those people that you have the relationship with, meaning they've seen what you've been able to do and they're completely on board with supporting a new program. I think if you try to go out and start a new program or create new ideas with a funder that you have absolutely no relationship with, I think you're, I don't want to say wasting your time, but I kind of think you're wasting your time, because if somebody's, they don't know anything about you, are they really going to give you, in some cases, 6, 7 figures? So I think it's important from a funder's perspective to really leverage those long-term, deep-seated relationships you have, because they are going to be the ones to support you, whether it's financially, whether it's with time, whether it's just word of mouth. So I think as you go down that path of innovation, I think you need to kind of come back to the farm, if you will, and say, okay, these families, these funders have been around a long time. I feel like they will support us and they will give us that ability to fail because, like I said, throughout the years, they've probably seen more successes than failures.
Nice. Have a question about what are strategies to be a policy agenda leader without being over partisan or political. And so, the Deaconess Foundation has been out there, promoting investment and advocacy from donors and helping us to get our heads around that for ages. Jorge, I'm sure that you've got some conversations going on among your leadership and your board. Rob, I'm sure you've got some great insights on this. Kind of who wants to start there?
I'll start. Part of, actually, we've been exploring ways that we can engage here more as a macro strategy. Our core business is our Deaconess Impact Partnership, so capacity building investments in a small number of organizations, but a deeper investment in the relationship building. But the question is, what's the macro strategy? How do we engage for children, particularly children in poverty, a broader social interest? And so one of these conversations connects with Rob's presentation. One of our former board members who's helping us think through this framed the situation that we find in St. Louis, that we are in a unique place. So as we talk about a responsibility, we find ourselves in a unique place between Citizens United and Citizens for Missouri's Children. Citizens United, of course, speaking to the things that Rob has noted, but also Citizens for Missouri's Children being the one statewide advocacy organization dedicated squarely to children that we had in Missouri that we memorialized about 2 years ago, which is also one of our first impact partners. So how is it that we engage in this work? There are several organizations that inform this. So I think about work from the grant makers for children, youth, and families who suggest that part of the role that foundations can play is as thought leader, making sure that we are out in the community supporting and advocating a broad policy agenda that focuses on children. I tell people all the time, we advocate for kids because guess what? They don't have money to make political contributions. They actually don't get a vote. So it's really easy when you need to make cuts to cut early childhood in the state of Missouri because even those organizations that serve them don't have a whole lot of resources to go and advocate in Jeff City, much less in D.C. So part of our role, I think, is to continue to use resources to place children in the center of the conversation. A lot of that is convening. Some of that is op-ed writing. Some of it, as we've engaged in more significantly recently through our staff, is building social networks across sectors in order to lift these issues. So I think those are all ways that we can do it. And of course, we must always align our funding strategies to support those. Because at the end of the day, we've got a pool of resources. So we can't say that we're going to talk about it and we're going to write out the ads and we're not going to fund anything. That's what we're really basically about. So I think we've got to do those things as well.
Rob?
So I want to ask, following up on the Citizens United conversation, I'm no elections law expert, but so far as I understand what Citizens United has indeed permitted, why not take the following path? Create a partner 501c4 entity to the Deaconess Foundation. And in those local races, either at city council or the mayor's office, whatever happens to be, where you believe with a strong degree of confidence that one candidate for office would be far superior on children's issues than the other. Create a partner 501c4 and issue advertising in the campaign in order to get that person elected rather than the other one.
I have some unique feelings about this, right? And they actually come from a pastoral perspective. So as you talk about tax reform, I tell people all the time, there's absolutely zero restriction to the church. So we also exist as a supporting organization to 2 conferences of the United Church of Christ. So we're a church mission. So we're 509(a)(3) as well as a 501(c)(3), which has different kinds of restrictions, but also different freedoms. There's absolutely nothing in the law that restricts a church entity, even the Deaconess Foundation, from doing exactly what you're talking about without setting up a 501(c)(4). Absolutely nothing. Nothing in the law. There's a line in the tax code that keeps us from doing it. Okay? So it's about choice. Which is most valuable? You've done additional writing, Rob, on the fact that the tax structure around philanthropy in the United States is actually quite novel in the world's history. And so part of the calculation is always what are the implications of that. I don't think there's much to stop us from doing it. It had made its way into our conversations with our advocacy committee. Our committee chair from our board is here. He may want to talk about this later. I can imagine that'll be a short conversation. But I think that's the kind of creativity we do need to think about and make the calculation. Is our tax status, in some cases, I say this for churches, is your tax status worth you being quiet in certain situations? Because most times churches actually overblow what their restrictions are, as do nonprofits. I encourage nonprofits to look at how much can you spend. There is a portion of money that you can spend on lobbying efforts, so just watch it closely. So I don't think there's anything there except for the counting of the cost and, as we talked about before, the conservative calculations of trustees. So I joke about that particular trustee, but the conservative calculations of trustees, and perhaps this calls for our board and governing leadership, as well as CEOs of these organizations and foundations, to really look closely at whether they can be more progressive in how they engage in these different strategies.
Well, and yeah. And not just that conservative leaning or nature or being sensitive to it on the trustee side, but then you go wading into political candidates and the portfolio of views that they have. While some of them might be perfect for you, you know, you may be alienating donors on the other side. So as you're looking for more of that private philanthropic funding, it's such a fine line, but, you know, I think that all of the comments have really enhanced this need for additional activity and visibility in the policy arena as all of these shifts are playing themselves out. We're just a couple of minutes in front of 10, and I wanted everybody to have an opportunity just to provide a parting comment. Jorge, maybe if you would start.
I think the only thing that I'd like to make sure to mention is that, and of course I'm coming at this from a particular bias, is that there's also, of course, changing demographics in the country. Hispanics being one of the largest growing sectors of the population. Of course, now also Asians having overtaken Hispanics as the largest by percentage growing. My point in that being is that I think that we have to reflect, we talked about boards, reflect that in our leadership. And when we're talking about we're needing more leaders, I think that we also have to be cognizant of who we're serving and what the population looks like. So I think that there is a need not to say that we select someone for their ethnicity over their capability, but I think that there is an important factor to be thought about as nonprofits move forward about who we're serving, who's leading, that it would also be reflective of the population as a whole.
Nice. Starsky?
Picking up on that theme, is Mark Zuckerberg not Alexis de Tocqueville? I remind people a lot that on these shifting demographics, Alexis de Tocqueville was in his 20s when he traveled the United States of America, wrote Democracy in America, talking about the philanthropic landscape and nature of this social contract here. And redefined, really framed our identity and what we sought to live up to in many ways for years following. And as we talk about these demographic shifts, we also recognize that those who are philanthropic in their 20s, 30s, want to put their bodies in before they put their money in. And don't look at sectors, right? So as we think about that, we must think about those individuals as well. What are their tendencies? Yes, they're more technologically focused, and they want to have hands-on, see impact, see what they've changed, don't want to spend a whole lot of time in board meetings. So as we consider the landscape, we also have to think about the active nature of those younger folks who are coming and how that changes the philanthropic landscape, because they have more resources earlier in many cases and the capacity to change and move an agenda, whether it has a whole lot of heft and substance or not. So that's another thing to consider as we think about philanthropy.
And they're all social entrepreneurs, right?
All of them.
Caroline?
Yeah, I think one of the things, probably my parting comment would be more along the advice factor. I think it's going to be very interesting to see what's going to happen both in the for-profit and not-for-profit world. Kind of going back to the original question, I think there's a lot of similarities. I think so it'll be interesting to see collaborations and how they're going to change. I think my advice would be, though, to everybody out here who's on the funding side, approaching family foundations, corporate foundations, would be to really do your homework, because as all of you are fighting for dollars, on the other side, it's how do you balance all of these people and how do you prioritize needs? And so I would say, if you go in to do a presentation, I think it's extremely important to do your homework and find out, is this a good fit for our organization? Is this something that they'll care about? Is this something that I will be able to get them hook, line, and sinker? I would also say the other thing to keep in mind too is that you have some very wealthy older people, more mature is probably the politically correct term, that as well, they cannot be with us forever, that they may eventually pass along as well. And how are you thinking about backfilling as those funders move on in life? Is it their families? And it may not necessarily be their families. So I think as you build your strategies, you kind of need to consider, if John Smith passes, does John Smith's kids feel as strongly about our organization, or are we going to lose them? And so what's our plan to retain them, or what's our plan to backfill them?
Nice. Kelly?
Maybe I'll try to leave it on a more upbeat note. It's been some grim statistics, and I think at times it seems really insurmountable what we're up against here. And I would just leave, I guess, with some parting thoughts to really think about the opportunity and the change that's ahead of us, and really take ownership and control of what we can change. We've heard a lot about what is out of our control to some degree. Obviously, we can participate, engage in these issues, try to shift them in the direction that will serve our missions and the communities that we serve. But at the end of the day, there's a lot out of our control in someone else's hands, and it's up to us as leaders within the sector and those who are carrying the missions on our shoulders to make sure that our communities get the services they need, and really to think about our work as a sector and how we define ourselves. We spend a lot of time focusing on this, idea as the nonprofit sector, and that it's so deficit-based, and we always deal with scarce resources and not enough. There's not enough staff, not enough resources to do what we need to do. But we need to find ways to shift the definition of how the bigness of what we do. That we really marginalize and diminish the bigness of our work by even defining ourselves as a nonprofit sector, by what we're not. As a female, I would not want to be defined as a non-male. So I think that we don't own the tremendous attributes that we have and the good that we're here to change the world. And I think that we need to continue to the degree that you can find the assets that you have and the hope of what we're trying to do here, and just find new ways of doing it. I think it really calls upon all of us to rethink and to talk to funders, to talk to boards about change, and be really honest and open about the implications, and that we know it's not going to look the same as it did. And so it's imperative that we all engage in that conversation and embrace uncertainty and figure out how we're going to be resilient through this. And there's opportunity for metamorphosis through the process. So I'll try to be upbeat.
We're a couple minutes over, but I want to make sure that Rob has an opportunity to give us a parting shot.
Just one quick thing, so I can't resist the invocation of Tocqueville and say something about that. Exactly right. That Tocqueville came to the United States as a Frenchman in his 20s, toured around. He was initially looking at prisons, but he came up with this amazing portrait of American exceptionalism relative to the rest of the world in our distinctive inclination to join up with each other in order to solve problems, rather than to look to an aristocrat or a government bureaucracy to do it for us. So this idea that we are a nation of joiners is really something to celebrate, certainly one of the key messages of democracy in America. Whether or not Mark Zuckerberg constitutes the new Alexis de Tocqueville, that's an interesting question. But the final thing I'll just mention here, in the spirit of de Tocqueville, and in the spirit of most of the comments here, that as you in your own organization, be you on the funding side or the service side, are pursuing your mission, not to lose sight of the grand importance of the social sector as a whole, let's call it, not the nonprofit sector, the social sector, or civil society. And as you have conversations with people of all different stripes, that you also articulate your own vision for what the sector's task is, because that's really, as I described before, what is fundamentally changing today. And in the absence of promulgating your own voice on that level of the discussion, that 35,000-foot level, then the forces beneath you will do all the work, and the people you work for and work on behalf of won't have a voice in that larger conversation. So please exercise that voice, develop a vision about the role that the nonprofit, the social sector should play in the United States, because it's of crucial importance.
Fantastic. It's a great continuance of the conversation, great comments, lots to think about, lots to act on. Will you please join me in thanking our guests and our speakers?
Yes, thank you again to Rob and our panelists, and Aaron, thank you very much for doing a great job and making all this possible.